daughter stopped the janitor in the hallway and whispered, "They hurt my mom. She's dying." Her troubled past stunned everyone. "You need to help me. They hurt my mom. She's dying." The 7-year-old girl grabbed Thomas Robinson's gray uniform with trembling hands, her hazel eyes filled with desperate tears as she looked up at him. Thomas was busy mopping the hallway on the 45th floor of the corporate tower when little Lily Richards rushed out of her mother's office. It was nearly 11 p.m. The building had emptied out, and the only person left who could help was the quiet janitor, greeted with distant nods from the executives. "Where is your mom?" Thomas asked, quickly dropping his mop. Lily pointed to the double-glass doors of the CEO's office, from which muffled sounds of shouting and scuffling were faintly audible. Thomas, at 33, had been working as a janitor in the building for 3 years. To everyone, he was just another invisible, silent worker. They barely acknowledged him as he kept the office spaces immaculate while the top brass carried on their high-stakes deals. What no one knew was that Thomas carried a past of personal sacrifice and deadly skill. He crouched down to Lily's height, his large hand softly resting on her shoulders. "Lily, I want you to go into that storage room and stay inside. Don't come out for anything, you understand?" Without a word, Lily nodded and disappeared into the room. When Thomas opened the office doors, he saw something that chilled him to the core. Jessica Richards, CEO of one of the country's top technology firms, was struggling to defend herself from 3 men in suits. The men were brutal, their fists landing with sickening force. "Stop!" Thomas yelled, catching their attention. They turned and sneered at him. "Look at this, boys. The janitor thinks he can play hero," one of them mocked. "Get lost, Black," another sneered, showing a handgun at his side. Then, in a flash, Thomas moved, dispatching all 3 attackers in quick, controlled movements. His body flowed with military precision, his actions speaking louder than any words could. It was a side of Thomas nobody had ever seen, the side that had remained hidden for years. Jessica, blood trickling from her lips, looked up at him in shock. "Who are you? How did you—" "Just a janitor who was in the right place at the right time," Thomas replied, his voice steady as he checked her injuries with swift efficiency. 20 minutes later, when the police arrived, they weren't treating Thomas like a hero. Instead, they questioned him with suspicion. Detective Harris, eyeing Thomas up and down, asked coldly, "You were alone with her when we arrived. How do we know you weren't involved in this?" "I saved her," Jessica protested, but Thomas saw the familiar look in the officer's eyes. To them, a black man alone with a rich white woman could only mean trouble. While answering the barrage of questions, Thomas remained calm, his composure betraying no fear, only quiet confidence. His eyes, however, held a certain serenity, one born from years of fighting through much more perilous situations. The detectives pressed further. "You were mopping the floor, but the cameras show you standing still for several minutes. Why were you spying on Miss Richards?" Detective Harris slammed a folder on the table, his patience thinning. Thomas leaned back, his posture rigid, betraying no hint of agitation. He had been through this before, questioned for the wrong reasons because of his appearance, but this time there was a resolve in his demeanor. "I wasn't spying," Thomas answered, his voice calm and measured. "I was doing my job." Detective Turner, Harris's partner, leaned in. "Convenient, isn't it? 3 armed men attack the CEO, and you just happen to be the one who stops them. Funny how that works, huh?" Just then, a phone call from the hospital where Jessica was being treated would change everything. Dr. Anderson's voice was tight over the phone. "Miss Richards, the tests you requested to be kept confidential have come back. You were drugged with a sedative before the assault. Someone planned this carefully." Jessica closed her eyes, the realization dawning on her. The attack hadn't been random. Someone had set her up, and they knew exactly when she would be alone in her office.
Her mind raced back to that afternoon's board meeting when she rejected the merger proposal from Sterling Enterprises. Vincent Sterling, the CEO of the rival company, had been furious. "You'll regret this, Jessica," he had warned her coldly. "There are ways to make stubborn people change their minds."
Vincent had meant more than just a hollow threat. The attack was no random act of violence. It was orchestrated. While Thomas was still being questioned by the police, Vincent Sterling sat in his office fuming with frustration. "Has the problem been dealt with?" he asked his lawyer, Greg Harper, as he poured himself a drink. "Partly," Harper replied, adjusting his glasses. "Jessica is in the hospital, but there was an issue. A janitor intervened. Now the police are asking questions." "A janitor? What's he going to do, mop up the mess?" Vincent snorted in derision. Harper continued, unfazed. "You might want to reconsider, Mr. Sterling. This janitor, according to my sources in the police, took down all 3 men in less than a minute. I don't think he's just your average cleaner." Meanwhile, Thomas sat in a dimly lit interrogation room. The questions from Detectives Harris and Turner kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. "You said you were mopping, but the cameras show you standing still for a good 15 minutes, Harris said, slamming a folder onto the table. "What exactly were you doing during that time?" Thomas kept his posture calm and composed, knowing what was coming. This wasn't the first time he'd been interrogated because of his appearance. But this time, there was something more behind his eyes. An unshakable calm that came from someone who had faced far worse. "I wasn't spying on anyone. I was just doing my job," he repeated, his voice unwavering. Detective Turner leaned in, clearly frustrated. "Convenient, huh? 3 trained attackers and the only person who can save her is you?" Thomas tilted his head slightly, considering the accusation. "That's an interesting theory, Detective. But tell me this. If I was working with them, why is Jessica still alive?" The question hung in the air, and for a brief moment Harris was speechless. Then, trying to regain control, Turner shot back. "Maybe because you realized the plan was falling apart and you needed to minimize the damage." But Thomas smiled, a calm, controlled smile, not one of nervousness, but of someone who knew exactly how this conversation would end. "Detectives, have you checked the street cameras between 10:47 p.m. and 10:52 p.m.?" he asked, his voice steady. Turner frowned. "Why that specific time?" "Because that's when a black van without license plates stopped in front of the building. 3 men got out, and at 10:52 p.m., the same van sped off with all 3 of them unconscious inside." The detectives exchanged a glance. This was information too specific to be fabricated. "How do you know that?" Harris asked. "I have a habit of noticing things that don't add up. A van with no plates in front of a corporate building at that hour. It would catch the attention of anyone who works in security." Detective Turner leaned in closer. "But you're a janitor. How would you know all that?" Thomas kept smiling. "Yes, I've been a janitor for 3 years. But before that," he paused dramatically, "I had other jobs." At that moment, the door to the room opened. A woman entered, carrying a briefcase. "I'm attorney Emily Foster, representing Mr. Robinson," she announced, cutting the interrogation short. Detective Harris protested. "We're in the middle of questioning him." "Without a warrant and no formal charges?" Emily responded smoothly. "My client is leaving now." As Thomas walked down the hallway with his lawyer, he asked quietly, "Did Jessica send you?" "Not exactly. Let's just say certain people know when someone with your background needs legal protection." "Background?" Emily stopped and looked him squarely in the eyes. "Sergeant Thomas Robinson, U.S. Army Special Forces, 3 tours in the Middle East, recipient of the Silver Star and Purple Heart." Thomas froze. "How do you know that?"
"The right people ask the right questions, Sergeant," Emily said with a knowing smile. "Now, we need to talk about why a decorated war hero is working as a janitor, and why someone very powerful wants both you and Jessica Richards gone." Meanwhile, across town, Vincent Sterling paced in his office, fuming. "What do you mean we couldn't find anything on him?" One of his private investigators, a man named Steve Thompson, shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing, sir. Clean criminal record, impeccable military history. No debts, no issues, no weaknesses." Vincent slammed his fist on the table. "There's always something. Find it."
Frustrated in his office, Thomas was quietly moving forward with his plan. He was no longer just the janitor. He was a man on a mission. A few hours later, Thomas received a call from Emily. "We have a problem," she said, her voice tense. "Vincent has obtained a temporary restraining order claiming that you pose a threat to the building where he works. You're banned from the corporate plaza." Thomas smiled, an expression that didn't match the gravity of the situation. "Perfect," he said calmly. "It means he's desperate." Emily didn't quite follow. "Perfect? How is that perfect? You can't protect Jessica now." "Not exactly," Thomas replied. "I don't need to be inside to protect her. I spent years protecting targets from a distance. Vincent's just given me the perfect excuse to use more creative methods." That night, Vincent left his office, unaware that a discreet figure was tailing him to the underground parking lot. He didn't notice the small hidden camera installed in his car, nor did he realize that his every phone conversation was being recorded by a sophisticated surveillance system operated by former military personnel. Thomas had done what few would expect from a janitor. He was gathering the intelligence necessary to bring down Sterling's empire. Meanwhile, Vincent, thinking himself safe and in control, spent his night in his $8 million mansion, secured by private guards and an advanced alarm system. What he didn't know was that across town, in his modest apartment, Thomas was orchestrating an operation using the skills Vincent didn't even know existed. His arrogance had become Vincent's greatest mistake. The next morning, Vincent woke up to an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was calm but determined. "Mr. Sterling, this is Jennifer Walsh from Investigative News. We have audio recordings of you ordering the attack on CEO Jessica Richards. Would you like to comment before the story airs at 6 p.m.? Vincent froze, his stomach sinking as the gravity of the situation hit him. "What recordings?" he demanded, his voice laced with panic. "That's impossible!" The reporter's voice was unwavering. "We have recordings where you discuss using Rohypnol and hiring men to intimidate Miss Richards. Would you like to make a statement?" Vincent slammed the phone down, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had his plans unraveled so quickly? 10 minutes later, his lawyer, Richard Ashford, stormed into his office, carrying a tablet. "Vincent, we've got a bigger problem. There are financial documents being leaked. Payments to private security firms that coincide with the attacks. And there's more. Audio recordings of you using physical persuasion on executives." Vincent snatched the tablet from Richard, his eyes widening as he saw the headline, "Billionaire CEO confesses to ordering violent attacks on business rivals." "This is impossible," Vincent muttered, panic setting in as he realized the scale of his downfall. Across town, Thomas sat in a cafe, his eyes glued to his phone as he watched Vincent's empire start to crumble. Emily sat beside him, smiling as she received constant updates from her contacts in the press. "The operation went better than expected," she remarked. Thomas nodded, his focus sharp. Vincent made the classic mistake. He thought he was hunting easy prey. He didn't realize he was being hunted. Emily's phone rang, and she picked it up with a raised brow. "It's Jessica," she said, answering the call on speakerphone.
Jonathan, Amanda, you need to see this. The FBI just raided Sterling Corporation. There are cameras from every news network. Vincent is being arrested live on TV. In Vincent's office, chaos reigned as federal agents swept through, seizing computers, files, and phones. Vincent, handcuffed and furious, screamed about his rights as he demanded to speak to more expensive lawyers. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez stood firmly before him. You're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, attempted murder, and forming a criminal organization. You have the right to silence. The cameras caught the moment when Vincent realized his entire world was crumbling. His eyes went wide as he saw the crowd of reporters gathered outside, capturing every moment. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I built this empire. I am Vincent Sterling. This is a setup." The reporters, sensing an opportunity, pounced on every word. His attempts to salvage his reputation only deepened his hole. In the following days, Vincent's fall was swift and unforgiving. The recordings revealed not just the attack on Jessica, but a decade-long web of corporate intimidation. Executives who had been too afraid to speak out now found their voices, and Sterling Corporation's stock price plummeted 78% in a mere 2 days. Corporate clients dropped their contracts, and banks froze his assets. But the most damning blow came from Patricia, his former secretary, who gave an exclusive interview detailing how Vincent humiliated employees. She recounted his words, "People like that janitor need to know their place."
All continued as more and more details of his corruption came to light. Meanwhile, in a federal prison, Vincent was forced to learn the true meaning of humility. Once the king of a sprawling corporate empire, he was now sweeping floors in the prison library, his orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. "Hurry up, Sterling," a guard barked. "You still have the cafeteria to clean." Vincent, who had once looked down on workers like this, now understood their value in a way he never had before. His cellmates, mostly wrongfully convicted men who shared similar stories, had become his teachers. They had taught him lessons no amount of money or power could buy. Meanwhile, Richard, Vincent's lawyer, brought more bad news. "Vincent, you've lost your last appeal. Your 25-year sentence has been upheld," he said grimly. "And on top of that, there's a new lawsuit from your former company seeking $2 billion in compensation for moral damages." Back in the real world, Thomas had become a national figure. He was invited to speak at universities about dignity, competence, and how true strength didn't come from the position you held, but from the values you carried. His story inspired thousands of workers to report abuse and discrimination, transforming the way companies would view their employees. Rachel, watching from the audience with Lily at her side, smiled with pride. Thomas had not only protected her and her daughter, but had turned a tragedy into a force for good. 6 months later, Thomas walked through the halls of the Corporate Plaza building, no longer the janitor, but the director of security. His well-tailored suit and leather briefcase commanded respect as employees greeted him with nods of recognition. His transformation was complete. "Good morning, Mr. Robinson." Lisa, the secretary who had once barely noticed him, greeted him with respect. On the 45th floor, Thomas paused in front of a gold plaque that read, "Thomas Robinson, Director of Security and Employee Protection." Inside his office, Lily was waiting for him, playing with her toys. "Uncle Thomas," she called, rushing to give him a hug. Jessica appeared in the doorway, smiling. Over the past few months, what had started as gratitude had grown into a deeper bond. "Ready to go? Alice is waiting in the car." Meanwhile, in federal prison, Vincent Sterling was learning a harsh lesson. He was now assigned to clean the floors of his prison cell block, an ironic twist for the man who had once mocked workers like Thomas. "Hurry up, Sterling," a guard shouted. "You still have the cafeteria to clean."
Vincent, who had once looked down on workers like this, now understood their value in a way he never had before. His cellmates, mostly wrongfully convicted men who shared similar stories, had become his teachers. They had taught him lessons no amount of money or power could buy. Meanwhile, Richard, Vincent's lawyer, brought more bad news. "Vincent, you've lost your last appeal. Your 25-year sentence is final. And there's more. Your former company is suing you for $2 billion in compensation for moral damages." Back in the real world, Thomas continued to lead, inspiring countless others with his story of resilience and honor. He proved that when you treat people with respect, they rise. When you push them down, they only come back stronger. Vincent's fall was a brutal spectacle that unfolded over the course of weeks, but the consequences of his arrogance reached far beyond his personal defeat. The media frenzy surrounding his arrest only gained momentum, and with it public support for the victims of his manipulation and corporate thuggery. The world watched as he was carted away to prison, a man who once thought himself untouchable, now reduced to a criminal. In contrast, Thomas Robinson's life was ascending. His work as the director of security at the Corporate Plaza building was just the beginning of his new path. His focus wasn't just on protecting Jessica and Lily anymore. He was building an entire system, one where any employee, regardless of position or background, could work without fear of intimidation or exploitation. His system was not only about keeping physical threats at bay, but about ensuring every person within the building felt respected and safe. Over time, employees began to notice the change. The corporate culture, which had once been rife with the oppressive air of power struggles and abuses, started shifting toward something more positive. People were encouraged to report issues, and a sense of camaraderie began to form within the building that hadn't existed before. Workers felt empowered to speak up, knowing they had a system that would protect them. In his first few months in the role, Thomas brought in former military personnel to train employees on security protocols, drawing from his own experiences to create a strategy that was both precise and proactive. His methods were effective, and they weren't just about preventing physical harm, but about fostering an atmosphere of mutual respect. The employees saw a man who had earned his place through integrity, skill, and a commitment to justice. The same qualities that had made him a hero in Afghanistan had now become an invaluable asset in the corporate world.
Prison, Vincent was facing an entirely new reality. The arrogant billionaire who had once commanded everything around him now found himself at the mercy of those he once looked down on. His days were spent cleaning floors, and his nights filled with the harsh lessons imparted by his fellow inmates. Among them was Marcus, a former soldier who had been wrongfully convicted. Marcus had little patience for Vincent's former sense of superiority. "How's it feel, Sterling?" Marcus would taunt him during their conversations. "You used to have an empire, a mansion, and millions. Now you're just another guy in prison, sweeping floors." Vincent's pride was slowly being broken down, piece by piece, until he realized that the world he had once manipulated was no longer within his control. The lessons he had once tried to teach others about power, status, and dominance were now being turned on him. He was no longer the one who dictated terms. He was at the mercy of others. Back in the corporate world, Thomas had become a symbol of change. His story spread beyond the walls of the Corporate Plaza building, and he was invited to speak at various conferences, universities, and forums about how dignity and respect in the workplace were essential for success. He often recounted how, as a janitor, he had observed the way people treated others based on their positions in the hierarchy, and how he had vowed that should he ever have the chance to do things differently, he would ensure that people were treated with respect regardless of their rank or job title. His journey inspired many, and slowly, companies across the country began to adopt similar policies. Thomas Robinson became not just a corporate security director, but a thought leader in the field of workplace equality and employee protection. The ripple effects of Thomas's actions were felt far beyond the corporate plaza building. Workers in various industries began demanding better treatment, and unions saw an uptick in membership as employees felt more empowered to stand up for their rights. There was a newfound respect for the people who were often overlooked, the janitors, the cleaners, the administrative assistants, and the realization that their contributions were just as valuable as any high-powered executive. Jessica Richards, now fully recovered from the attack, stood by Thomas's side, proud of the changes he had spearheaded. She too had become an advocate for a more inclusive and respectful work environment. She began to speak out about her experiences, sharing her story in public forums and lobbying for better protections for women in the corporate world. She understood firsthand the dangers of the type of corporate culture that had allowed Vincent Sterling to thrive. It wasn't long before Jessica offered Thomas an even higher position within her company, one that would give him the power to shape corporate policy on a national scale. He hesitated for a moment, his loyalty to the workers who had supported him throughout his career never far from his mind. But he agreed. The role was one he could use to continue the fight he had started. His mission had evolved from protecting a single company to ensuring that every employee, no matter their background, would have the chance to thrive in a respectful and safe environment. As the months passed, Vincent Sterling's reputation continued to deteriorate. His story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked greed and arrogance. Meanwhile, in the prison, his days grew darker. He had lost everything: the empire, the money, the control, and now he had nothing left but the cold reality of his own actions. One afternoon, during a visit, his lawyer, Richard Ashford, told him the worst news yet. "Vincent, the class action lawsuit from your former employees has been approved. They are now suing you for compensation for the mistreatment they endured during your reign. The company is also suing for moral damages. They want $2 billion. Vincent's face fell. He had no more money, no more influence. All his resources had been spent trying to cover his tracks, but it was too late. The truth had come to light, and there was no escaping it. At the same time, in the real world, Thomas's influence was growing. He had been appointed to advisory boards, consulting with major corporations about restructuring their internal systems. His principles of fairness, respect, and safety became the gold standard for employee treatment in the corporate world. His efforts didn't just change his company, they changed industries.
As Thomas continued to shape the future of workplace culture, he never forgot his roots. He kept in touch with the employees who had helped him along the way, ensuring that the system he had built remained intact. No longer just a janitor, he was a man of vision, someone who had gone from cleaning floors to changing lives. Rachel, now an even stronger advocate for fairness and equality, continued to stand by Thomas. She had once been the victim of a powerful man's cruelty, but now, thanks to the support of people like Thomas, she had become a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. The final twist came when Vincent's former company, Sterling Corporation, was forced to dismantle its entire operations. The board voted to remove every member associated with Vincent, and the company's assets were liquidated. It had become a symbol of corporate corruption, its once proud name now synonymous with greed and exploitation. In the end, Vincent Sterling's empire was destroyed not by the hands of his enemies, but by his own arrogance. The very system he had used to oppress and exploit others had come crashing down, and in its place, a new world was emerging, one in which every worker, no matter their position, had a voice. And as for Thomas, he stood tall, proud of the changes he had fought for and the lives he had transformed. He had not only defeated a man like Vincent Sterling, he had created a legacy that would outlive him,
a legacy that would continue to inspire others long after he was gone. The janitor-turned-hero had proven that the true strength of a man lies not in the position he holds, but in the integrity and courage with which he lives his life. 6 months later, Thomas stood in front of a crowded auditorium, speaking at a corporate ethics conference. His story had become a symbol of transformation, a story of a man who had risen from obscurity to shape a new era of workplace equality and respect. He had become the voice for those who had always been overlooked, and now he was addressing an audience of CEOs, HR directors, and managers from some of the most powerful companies in the world. As he spoke, he reflected on how far he had come. The janitor who had once swept the floors of the corporate plaza building was now the director of a national initiative aimed at changing how businesses approached employee welfare. His message was simple but profound. Respect for every worker, no matter their job title or background, was the foundation of any truly successful company. The crowd was captivated as Thomas outlined the principles he had implemented, not just in his company, but across the industries he had touched. He spoke about the importance of transparency, about creating safe spaces for employees to voice concerns, and about ensuring that every worker, from the janitor to the CEO, had a seat at the table. Rachel, sitting in the front row with Lily by her side, watched Thomas with pride. She knew that he had changed everything, not just for her, but for so many others. She had never imagined that the man who had saved her life would become the person to challenge an entire corporate culture that had long upheld the exploitation of the vulnerable. Meanwhile, in the prison, Vincent Sterling's life had taken a darker turn. His former company had filed lawsuits for every abuse, every crime, and every violation of the law. As the legal battles piled up, Vincent had no more resources to fight. He had been forgotten by the world outside, and his name had become synonymous with corporate corruption and greed. His former loyal followers had abandoned him, leaving him to stew in his resentment. But Vincent's arrogance had not completely diminished. He still believed, in some small part of his mind, that he could find a way to turn things around. However, it was too late. The people who had suffered under his reign had found their voices, and the very system he had used to oppress them was now his undoing.
As the months wore on, the corporate world continued to evolve under the influence of Thomas's work. More and more companies adopted the practices he had pioneered, creating environments where employees were no longer afraid to speak up. The anonymous reporting channels, once considered a radical idea, became a standard in corporate security protocols. Executives who had once viewed their workers as expendable resources were now required to listen and take action to ensure their safety and dignity. Thomas, however, never sought the spotlight. His work had always been about the people, the workers who had been treated as invisible for so long. He continued to lead with the same humility he had shown during his time as a janitor. And as the culture shifted, he found new ways to make a difference. He worked with nonprofits, giving talks at schools and community centers about the value of every person, regardless of their background. He spoke about how dignity in the workplace wasn't just a right, it was essential to the very success of any business. The legal system, meanwhile, continued to dismantle Vincent's empire piece by piece. The investigations into his actions reached far beyond his direct crimes, uncovering a network of corruption and bribery that stretched across industries. People who had once been too afraid to speak out now found the courage to testify, and the legal documents piled up against him. In the prison, Vincent's reputation had completely disintegrated. His arrogance had faded into bitterness and regret, but it was too late for redemption. His days were spent under the watchful eyes of the very people he had once despised.
His cellmate, Marcus, had become a constant reminder of the man Vincent had once been and the man he had now become. "You used to think you were untouchable. Now look at you, sweeping floors, getting your meals in a cafeteria like everyone else. You've lost everything." Vincent had no response, the weight of his own downfall crushing him. The reality of his situation had finally settled in. He had spent his life building an empire of fear and control, only to watch it all crumble, piece by piece, because he had underestimated the power of people who refused to be silenced. Back in the world outside the prison walls, Thomas had become a force for change that was impossible to ignore. His efforts had influenced not just businesses, but also governments, labor unions, and educational institutions. He was invited to speak at the United Nations on corporate responsibility, where he advocated for policies that ensured fair treatment and protection for workers globally. One day during a visit to a university, Thomas was approached by a young student who had heard his story and was deeply inspired. The student asked, "Mr. Robinson, how do you stay so focused on the mission, even when the odds were stacked against you?" Thomas smiled, a rare moment of vulnerability slipping through. He said, "It's simple. I've seen the worst that the world can offer, and I know how much one person can make a difference. When you stand up for what's right, when you fight for others, you're never really alone." His words echoed through the auditorium, and the room erupted in applause. He wasn't just speaking about workplace reform anymore. He was speaking about humanity. The need to treat every person with respect, to recognize their inherent worth, was a message that resonated far beyond corporate policies. It was a call for societal change. Back in the corporate plaza building, now a symbol of transformation, Thomas had made his mark. His leadership had brought about a revolution in how businesses viewed their employees, how they treated them, and how they empowered them. He had not just protected one woman or one child. He had protected an entire system of workers from the injustices that had plagued them for years. And as he walked through the hallways of the building, now filled with employees who respected one another, Thomas knew that the battle was far from over, but he had ignited a spark, one that would continue to burn long after he was gone. His legacy was secure. He had proven that one man, armed with integrity and the will to fight for what's right, could change the world.
Meanwhile, Vincent's time in prison grew more isolating as his mental state began to deteriorate. No longer the powerful, arrogant man who had once commanded the attention of boardrooms and the press, he was now reduced to a shadow of his former self. His attempts to negotiate with the outside world to regain some semblance of power were met with indifference or outright rejection. His former colleagues and business associates had long since distanced themselves, not just because of his crimes, but because they had come to realize that his actions had destroyed everything he had built. The empire he had fought so hard to control had turned to dust, and all that was left was his own misery. One day, during a routine meeting with his attorney, Richard Ashford, Vincent finally broke down. "What have I done? How did it all fall apart so fast?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard, ever the professional, responded cautiously. "You built something on fear and greed, Vincent. You never cared about anyone but yourself. You treated people as tools to be used, and in the end, that's what happened to you. You were used." Vincent's eyes glazed over as he stared at the wall, a hollow realization settling in. The very system he had created had devoured him. He had underestimated the people he had trampled on, thinking they would always be beneath him. But now the world had turned, and it was he who had become the prey. The once proud billionaire had become just another prisoner, another casualty of his own greed and arrogance. And while his name continued to fade into obscurity, the legacy of the janitor, who had once been invisible, was only growing stronger. The story of Thomas Robinson, the janitor turned corporate security director, continued to inspire people around the world. His message of dignity, respect, and fairness became a guiding principle for countless workers, businesses, and individuals. He had turned a tragic event into a catalyst for change, and his efforts had reshaped an entire industry. Vincent Sterling's name, once synonymous with power and wealth, was now a cautionary tale. His downfall was a reminder that no amount of money or influence could shield someone from the consequences of their actions. The arrogance that had led him to underestimate others had been his undoing, and his empire had crumbled as a result. Thomas had shown the world that true strength comes not from the position you hold or the power you wield, but from the values you uphold and the way you treat others. His legacy was one of hope, justice, and the belief that no one, no matter their job title or background, should ever be treated as invisible. As for Vincent, his fate was sealed, but for Thomas, the journey was just beginning. The fight for justice and equality would continue, and he would be there, leading the charge, reminding the world that the most powerful thing anyone could do was stand up for what was right. And so, the story of the janitor turned hero ended, but the lessons he had taught would live on forever. In the months that followed, the movement that Thomas had sparked continued to grow. His efforts weren't limited to just one company or one industry. His vision had become a global movement, championing fairness, equality, and respect for workers at all levels. His voice was heard not just in corporate boardrooms, but in classrooms, at community events, and even in international policy discussions. He was invited to participate in global conferences that addressed worker rights, corporate responsibility, and ethical leadership. His story of how a janitor had risen to the position of director, advocating for the protection of every employee, was a symbol of what could happen when people were empowered to make a difference. He was now regarded as a leading voice in workplace reform, and his influence spread beyond the corporate world. Meanwhile, Vincent Sterling's reputation continued to erode. News outlets continued to expose the full extent of his crimes, and his downfall was one of the most publicized and shocking in corporate history. Federal investigations were still ongoing, and his name became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and greed. In prison, Vincent was slowly losing his mind. The isolation, the realization that he would never regain the life he had built, was wearing him down. The anger that had once fueled his rise now consumed him, but there was nothing he could do. He had lost everything: his empire, his wealth, his influence. Every day he was confronted by the harsh reality that he had spent his life climbing over others, using them as stepping stones, only to fall into a pit of his own making. No amount of money, no high-priced lawyer, and no amount of influence could save him now. The world had moved on, and Vincent had been left behind, a forgotten relic of a time when the powerful were untouchable.
Back in the corporate plaza building, Thomas's leadership had completely transformed the work environment. His approach to security had expanded to include emotional and psychological well-being for all employees. He believed that a safe workplace wasn't just about physical protection. It was about fostering an environment where people felt heard, valued, and supported.
His security team, made up of former military personnel and specialized experts in workplace dynamics, worked tirelessly to ensure that the building was not just a place for work, but a community where employees could thrive. Under Thomas's guidance, the Corporate Plaza building became a model of best practices in corporate culture. The anonymous reporting systems flourished, and employees felt comfortable speaking up about issues ranging from harassment to unethical business practices. The culture of fear that had once dominated the building was replaced with a culture of accountability, respect, and trust. Jessica Richards, now a powerful advocate for workplace reform, continued to work alongside Thomas. She used her position to push for broader systemic change in the corporate world. Her own experience, having been a target of violence because of her refusal to comply with corporate pressure, made her a strong ally in Thomas's efforts. Together, they championed policies that prioritized employee well-being and ensured that no one would have to suffer in silence again. One of their most significant achievements was the establishment of a nationwide initiative aimed at eliminating workplace harassment and discrimination. The initiative provided companies with the tools to create safer, more inclusive environments, and it quickly became a model that many corporations adopted. As Thomas continued to rise through the ranks of corporate security, his personal life flourished as well. He had become a father figure not only to Lily, but to many others who'd been impacted by his work. He was often invited to speak at schools and youth centers, where he shared his story to inspire young people to believe in themselves and fight for what's right. Rachel, too, had found a new purpose. Her work alongside Thomas had opened her eyes to the importance of advocating for those who had no voice. She began to speak out about gender inequality in the corporate world and to fight for the rights of women who'd been silenced by the same toxic corporate culture that had nearly destroyed her. Together, they made an unstoppable team, and their efforts inspired a new generation of leaders. The bond between Thomas, Rachel, and Lily grew stronger every day. What had started as a chance encounter, a desperate plea for help, had blossomed into a deep, unwavering connection. They were a family, united by a shared mission and a commitment to making the world a better place. Thomas was no longer just a janitor who had saved a life. He was a leader, an advocate, and a symbol of hope for those who had long been overlooked. His journey had been filled with trials, but in the end, it was those very challenges that had made him the man he was. Someone who understood the importance of integrity, humility, and standing up for what's right. And as Vincent Sterling sat in his prison cell, the world outside continued to move on without him. His name became synonymous with failure, and his empire was dismantled piece by piece. The corporate world had moved past him, and now, instead of being the one calling the shots, he was left to reflect on his mistakes in the solitude of his confinement. The contrast between the two men was stark. On one hand, you had Vincent Sterling, a man who had once held the reins of an empire, now a shadow of his former self, struggling to come to terms with the consequences of his actions. On the other, you had Thomas Robinson, a man who had started with nothing but his integrity, who had fought for what was right and had changed the world as a result. As the months passed, it became clear that Thomas's story wasn't just about one man's rise from the bottom. It was about the power of standing up for justice, no matter the odds. It was about the strength of character, the belief that every person, regardless of their station in life, deserved respect and dignity. Vincent's story, on the other hand, was a cautionary tale. A reminder that no matter how high you climb, if you trample on others along the way, you will eventually fall. And when you do, there may be no one left to catch you.